In the mountains of Mongolia, there is a place where the past seems almost deliberately hidden. Somewhere beyond the modern roads, beyond the cities and monuments built in his memory, the remains of the man who once commanded the largest contiguous land empire in history may still lie beneath the earth. No confirmed grave has ever been found, no authenticated remains have ever been publicly examined, and no piece of DNA has ever been universally accepted as belonging to him. Yet, almost 8 centuries after his death, the family he created may still be alive, in numbers that would have been impossible for anyone in the 13th century to imagine. They do not live behind palace walls, and most do not carry a name that immediately reveals their ancestry. Some live in Mongolia, others in Kazakhstan, China, Uzbekistan, Russia, and across the wider regions that were once absorbed into the Mongol world. Some families have preserved genealogies that claim descent from the Great Khan, while others have only fragments of stories passed down through generations. And for most of them, the same descent fates. And somewhere inside this enormous population may be descendants whose connection to Genghis Khan is not merely legend, but a genuine biological link. The strange part is that historians still cannot tell us exactly how many there are, because the very evidence that might solve the mystery has remained buried with the man himself. Genghis Khan was not born into the position that later made him one of the most feared and influential rulers in history. He was born Temujin, probably around 1162, into a world of competing Mongol and steppe tribes, where alliances could collapse overnight, and political survival depended as much on family relationships as military strength. His father, Yesuge, was a tribal leader, but Temujin's childhood was shattered when his father was poisoned by enemies, leaving his family vulnerable and isolated. For years, Temujin and his mother, Heolun, struggled to survive, and his early life was marked by betrayal, captivity, hunger, and the constant threat of rival tribes. These experiences mattered, because the man who eventually built an empire was not simply handed power. He spent decades learning how easily loyalty could disappear, and how quickly a powerful family could become helpless. When he finally began gathering followers around himself, he built his authority through a combination of military ability, personal loyalty, political calculation, and an unusual willingness to reward competence, rather than rely entirely on traditional tribal hierarchy. By 1206, after defeating or absorbing many of his major rivals, Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan. At that moment, the man who would become the ancestor of countless later dynasties had not yet conquered the enormous territories associated with his name, but he had accomplished something arguably more important. He had transformed a fractured collection of steppe tribes into a political and military force capable of expanding far beyond Mongolia. The expansion that followed changed the history of Eurasia. Mongol armies moved into northern China, Central Asia, Iran, and eventually toward Eastern Europe, while Genghis Khan's successors continued the conquests after his death in 1227. The empire was never a perfectly unified state in the modern sense, and it eventually divided into several major khanates, but the territories controlled by the descendants of Genghis Khan covered an astonishing portion of the Eurasian continent. This expansion created something that would become crucial to the survival of the family line. The sons and grandsons of Genghis Khan were not simply heirs to wealth. They became rulers of enormous territories, and their descendants inherited political legitimacy from their connection to the founder of the dynasty. Yoki's descendants became associated with the Western Steppe and the Golden Horde. Chagatai's descendants ruled much of Central Asia. Toloi's descendants produced rulers connected to the Yuan Dynasty in China and the Ilkhanate in Persia. Ogeday's line also produced powerful rulers before losing its central political position. In other words, Genghis Khan's family tree became a map of Eurasia. Every generation carried the dynasty farther away from the Mongolian homeland, and every political marriage created another opportunity for the bloodline to enter a different population. This is the first reason the modern descendants are so difficult to identify. They did not remain one family living in one place. They became hundreds of families, then thousands, spread across territories that would eventually develop completely different languages, religions, cultures, and national identities. The most important branch for understanding the western spread of the family begins with Zoki, Genghis Khan's eldest son. Zoki's descendants would become the rulers of the Oghuz of Zoki, the political world that later became known as the Golden Horde. Zoki himself died before his father, but his descendants continued to rule vast areas of the Eurasian steppe. Batu Khan, one of Zoki's sons, became one of the most powerful Mongol rulers in the West, and led the great Mongol campaigns into Eastern Europe. Later, Berke Khan, another son of Zoki, became famous as one of the first major Mongol rulers to embrace Islam, creating an important connection between the Chinggisid Dynasty and the Islamic world. Over the generations, the rulers of the Golden Horde became increasingly integrated into the Turkic-speaking societies of the steppe, and this transformation is essential to understanding modern ancestry. A descendant of Zochi living centuries later might no longer speak Mongolian or consider himself culturally Mongol in the way his 13th-century ancestors had. He might speak a Turkic language, practice Islam, and identify with a population that did not yet exist as a modern nation when Genghis Khan was alive. The dynasty survived by changing. Its political identity adapted to new circumstances, and its descendants became part of the societies they ruled. This is why Kazakhstan occupies such an interesting place in the story. The modern Republic of Kazakhstan did not exist when Genghis Khan lived, but the vast steppe that later became central to Kazakh history was deeply connected with the political world created by his descendants. For centuries, families belonging to the Toray, or Toray tradition, claimed descent from the Chinggisid ruling house, and this ancestry could carry special political status. Members of these families were not simply ordinary nobles. Their supposed connection to Genghis Khan's dynasty could give them legitimacy when ruling or competing for power in the steppe. It's a factory moment of history, says Chinggisid. Even after the great Khanates disappeared and modern political systems replaced the old order, genealogical memories survived. Some families continued to preserve their ancestry through written genealogies and oral traditions. This does not mean every claim can be independently proven, because medieval genealogical records can be incomplete, and political prestige gave people strong reasons to emphasize prestigious ancestry. But the survival of Chinggisid genealogical traditions is itself important evidence that the dynasty did not simply disappear after the Mongol Empire fragmented. It continued inside later societies, sometimes hidden behind completely different political and cultural identities. The same pattern appeared farther east. Genghis Khan's descendants became deeply connected with the history of Mongolia and China, especially through the descendants of his son Tolui. Tolui's son, Menke, became Great Khan, while another son, Kublai, eventually established the Yuan Dynasty in China. Kublai's reign transformed the relationship between the Mongol ruling family and Chinese political traditions, and the Yuan Dynasty eventually fell in 1368. But the fall of a dynasty did not mean that every descendant vanished. Members of the wider Mongol ruling family continued to exist, and different branches maintained their identities for generations. Some remained politically important, while others gradually lost their influence. This is one of the recurring patterns in the history of Genghis Khan's descendants. Political power disappeared much faster than biological ancestry. A dynasty can lose an empire in a few decades, but the descendants of that dynasty can continue for centuries without holding any throne at all. That distinction becomes even more important when we reach the modern era, because there is no single Genghis Khan family today in the way people often imagine. There is no surviving imperial court in Mongolia waiting for the return of a great Khan. There is no universally recognized royal family whose members can simply be counted. Instead, there are historical lineages, regional families, oral traditions, and genetic clues. Some people can trace their ancestry through several generations of documented records. Others belong to families traditionally regarded as descendants of the Chinggisid Dynasty. And then there are millions of people whose genetic ancestry may connect them to the Mongol imperial period without any surviving family record proving the exact relationship. These categories are often mixed together, but they should not be. Being descended from someone who lived under the Mongol Empire is not the same as being descended from Genghis Khan. Carrying a genetic lineage associated with Mongol-era elites is not the same as having a documented genealogy leading directly to Genghis Khan. And belonging to a family that claims Chinggisid ancestry is not automatically proof unless the genealogy can be independently supported. The closer we look, the more complicated the story becomes. Then, in the early 21st century, genetics appeared to offer an extraordinary clue. In 2003, researchers studying Y chromosome variation across Asia identified a particular paternal lineage occurring at unusually high frequency across a large region. The lineage was found in approximately 8% of men in the population sampled and was estimated to represent roughly 0.5% of the world's male population at the time. The researchers calculated that the lineage could have originated around 1,000 years ago and proposed that its remarkable expansion was probably connected to a powerful male lineage that lived in the region during the period of the Mongol Empire. Because the geographic distribution, estimated age, and social circumstances seem to fit the history of Genghis Khan and his male descendants, the researchers proposed that the lineage might have originated from him or his close male relatives. The media quickly turned the scientific hypothesis into a much simpler story. Zephyros Khan had millions of descendants. The number of 16 million became famous, and suddenly headlines around the world presented the Mongol conqueror as one of history's most prolific fathers. But the real scientific conclusion was more cautious. The researchers had not found Genghis Khan's DNA. They had found a genetic lineage and proposed a historical explanation for its extraordinary spread. That difference is not a technical footnote. It is the heart of the mystery. The Y chromosome is particularly useful for this kind of investigation because it is passed from father to son, meaning that a paternal lineage can sometimes be followed genetically across many generations. If a powerful man had numerous sons, and those sons had many sons of their own, a Y chromosome lineage could expand dramatically while remaining relatively recognizable. The social structure of the Mongol Empire made such expansion plausible. Members of the ruling elite could have far greater reproductive opportunities than ordinary men, and their sons could inherit political power, wealth, status, and access to further marriage alliances. A successful ruling dynasty, therefore, had the ability to reproduce not only politically, but biologically. Yet this does not mean Genghis Khan personally fathered anything close to 16 million children. The famous number refers to possible male line descendants many generations later. Imagine one man having several sons, those sons having several sons, and a process continuing for 20 or 30 generations. The number of descendants can become enormous. The important question is not whether Genghis Khan could personally father millions of children, because obviously he could not. The question is whether a paternal lineage originating with him or one of his close male relatives could expand dramatically through successive generations. Genetically, that is entirely possible. Historically, the Mongol ruling system provides a plausible mechanism, but plausibility still falls short of direct proof. There is another problem that makes the mystery even more fascinating. The genetic lineage identified in 2003 may not necessarily have belonged to Genghis Khan himself. It could have originated with a close male relative, an ancestor, or another powerful man living in the same broad region and period. The original study's researchers understood this uncertainty. Their hypothesis was based on the age, geographical distribution, and historical circumstances surrounding the lineage, not on a direct genetic comparison with Genghis Khan. Without a securely identified grave and authenticated remains, nobody can honestly say that the chromosome belongs to Genghis Khan himself. The claim became more famous than the evidence supporting it. This happens frequently when complicated scientific research enters popular culture. A careful sentence such as "this lineage may have originated from Genghis Khan or his male relatives" becomes a headline saying, "Genghis Khan fathered 16 million descendants." The second statement is far more memorable, but the first is much closer to what the evidence actually allows us to say. For years, this was where the mystery remained. Then researchers began looking at people who could be connected through traditional genealogies. Families claiming descent from Genghis Khan's sons became especially valuable because they provided a bridge between historical records and modern genetics. One notable study examined men from the Touré clan of Kazakhstan and compared them with individuals from northwestern China who belonged to families claiming descent from Genghis Khan's son Togun. The researchers found paternal genetic relationships that suggested these different claimed Chinggisid lineages shared a relatively recent male ancestor. The study also proposed a different candidate haplogroup as potentially connected with the Genghis Khan lineage, demonstrating just how unsettled the question remains. Instead of giving historians one final answer, the research revealed that the story was more complicated than the popular version. There may have been several branches of the Mongol imperial elite, and different historical descendants may carry closely related but distinct paternal lines. The search therefore shifted from simply asking, which chromosome belongs to Genghis Khan, to a much more sophisticated question about the genetic structure of the entire Chinggisid ruling population. Ancient DNA has now added another layer to that investigation. Recent research involving medieval individuals associated with Golden Horde elite mausoleums in Kazakhstan has identified paternal relationships and Y chromosome lineages connected with the broader genetic date Mongol 4 days later. Research contains the Chinggisid ruling project. Dynasty. These findings are important because they move the evidence backward in time. Instead of studying only modern men who claim descent from Genghis Khan, researchers can examine actual people who lived during the era of his descendants. If a genetic lineage found in modern populations also appears in medieval individuals known to belong to the Golden Horde elite, the connection becomes much more compelling. But even this does not solve the final mystery. A medieval Golden Horde elite individual carrying a particular Y chromosome is evidence of the lineage's presence within the Mongol imperial world, not proof that Genghis Khan himself carried that exact lineage. The distinction remains unavoidable until his own remains are identified. And that brings us to the grave. Genghis Khan died in 1227, but the exact circumstances and location of his burial remain surrounded by uncertainty. Historical traditions connect his burial with the Mongolian homeland, and particularly with the region associated with Burkhan Khaldun, but no universally accepted tomb has been found. There have been searches, archaeological investigations, satellite studies, and countless theories, yet the definitive grave has remained elusive. That absence has protected one of the most important mysteries in Mongol history. If his remains were securely identified, scientists could potentially extract DNA and compare it with living descendants and ancient individuals. A single verified sample could transform decades of speculation into evidence. It could tell us whether the famous Y chromosome lineage really belongs to him, whether the genealogies of certain families are accurate, and perhaps even reveal details about his ancestry that historical sources cannot provide. But until that happens, every genetic claim remains indirect. The mystery of the burial may not be accidental. Mongol burial traditions and latest stories surrounding Genghis Khan's death have created a powerful legend of secrecy. Some accounts describe extraordinary efforts to conceal the burial location, although many details in later traditions are difficult to verify. What is certain is that the grave has not been conclusively identified. The absence of the tomb has therefore become part of Genghis Khan's mythology. His empire can be mapped, his campaigns can be reconstructed, his descendants can be traced through historical records. But the man himself remains strangely elusive. We know where he lived, where he fought, who his sons were, and how his empire expanded. Yet we cannot point to the ground and say with certainty, here is the man who began it all. This is also why the modern search for descendants cannot rely on surnames. The surname Khan is not evidence of descent from Genghis Khan. The word was a political title used by many rulers across Asia and later became a common name in several societies. Someone named Khan today could have no connection to the Chinggisid family whatsoever. At the same time, a genuine descendant might have a surname that tells us absolutely nothing about Mongol ancestry. This is especially true through female lines. If a daughter or granddaughter of a Chinggisid prince married into another family, her descendants could continue carrying her ancestry without retaining the dynasty's name. After several centuries of such marriages, the original surname could vanish completely, while the genetic connection remained. This is one reason why the number of descendants through all lines could be vastly larger than the number of people who identify themselves as Chinggisid. The story becomes even more complicated when we consider the populations living in areas once controlled by the Mongols. The Mongol armies moved enormous numbers of people across Eurasia. Soldiers, administrators, merchants, craftsmen, captives, and families traveled with or after the armies. Some populations were displaced, while others entered new political systems. The empire connected regions that had previously been separated by distance and war, and this movement created centuries of genetic mixing. Central Asian populations today therefore contain ancestry from many historical groups, including Mongol, Turkic, Iranian, East Asian, and other populations. A genetic signal associated with the Mongol period does not automatically identify a direct descendant of Genghis Khan. It may instead reflect ancestry from one of the many thousands of people who participated in or were affected by the Mongol expansion. The empire was enormous, and its genetic legacy is correspondingly complicated. The Hazara communities of Afghanistan provide another example of how easily the story can become oversimplified. Historical traditions have associated the Hazara with Mongol soldiers and the armies of Genghis Khan and his successors, and genetic research has identified substantial Central and East Asian ancestry in Hazara populations. Some paternal lineages may reflect ancestry connected to medieval Mongol or related populations. But this does not allow us to say that the Hazara as a whole are descendants of Genghis Khan. Nor does it allow us to identify every individual Hazara person as a descendant of the Great Khan. The correct conclusion is narrower. The population carries genetic and historical connections to Central and East Asian populations that entered the region during different periods, including the era of Mongol expansion. The distinction may sound small, but it is essential if we want the story to remain historical rather than turning into mythology. The same caution applies to Mongolia itself. Modern Mongolia contains families with traditions of Chinggisid ancestry, but there is no single identifiable group of people who can be described as the descendants of Genghis Khan. The modern Mongolian population has experienced centuries of migration, marriage, political change, and interaction with neighboring peoples. A person living in Ulaanbaatar today may have ancestors connected to many different Mongol tribes and historical communities. Some may have Chinggisid ancestry, while others may not. The legacy of Genghis Khan is therefore much larger than his biological family. He became a national historical symbol, and his name now represents an entire civilization and historical period, rather than a single genetic lineage. Perhaps the strongest surviving evidence of the family's political continuity comes from the Chinggisid rulers who continued to appear throughout Central Asian history long after the original empire had fragmented. Descendants of Genghis Khan remained valuable as symbols of legitimacy. A ruler who could demonstrate descent from the Great Khan possessed something that could not easily be created through military victory alone. This was especially important in the steppe political tradition, where ancestry could determine who had the right to claim the title of Khan. As new states and dynasties emerged, Chinggisid princes could still be used as legitimate figureheads or claimants. In some cases, powerful military leaders who were not themselves Chinggisids needed a member of Genghis Khan's family to provide dynastic legitimacy. The survival of the family was therefore not simply biological. It remained politically useful for centuries. One of the clearest examples came with Timur, better known in the West as Tamerlane. Timur built an enormous empire across Central Asia, Persia, and beyond. But he was not himself a direct descendant of Genghis Khan. Instead, his political strategy involved connecting his rule to the Chinggisid dynasty through marriage and by placing members of the Mongol royal family in formal positions of authority. Later, Timurid rulers would also emphasize their relationship with the Chinggisid legacy. This tells us something important about the power of the family name. Even more than a century after Genghis Khan's death, descent from him remained valuable enough that one of the most powerful conquerors in Central Asian history needed to position himself in relation to the dynasty. Eventually, however, the political value of the Chinggisid bloodline declined as modern states replaced medieval systems of dynastic rule. The Russian Empire expanded into Central Asia. The Qing dynasty incorporated Mongolia. Later, the Soviet Union transformed political and social structures throughout much of the region. Traditional aristocratic privileges disappeared or were heavily restricted. Families that once possessed special status could become ordinary citizens. Their ancestry might survive in private memory, but it no longer gave them the power it had provided centuries earlier. This is one of the greatest ironies of the story. A family descended from the man who once controlled enormous territories could eventually become indistinguishable from the people around it. The empire disappeared, the titles disappeared, and in some cases, even the knowledge of the family's origins disappeared. But the biological connection could remain. There is perhaps no better example of the transformation from imperial dynasty to ordinary family than the modern descendants of Genghis Khan, who have chosen privacy. Some families connected to the Chinggisid tradition have avoided publicity, while others have been identified by historians because their genealogies are of scholarly interest. But there is no evidence that the surviving descendants collectively consider themselves part of a political movement or attempt to restore a Mongol empire. They live under modern governments, work ordinary jobs, and in many cases have little interest in public attention. The idea of a hidden royal family waiting to reclaim its inheritance belongs more to fiction than to history. The descendants inherited ancestry, not the empire, and forced into the fact of love and consent of history. And that may be the most important thing to understand about them. A descendant of Genghis Khan today is not automatically a Mongol warrior, a prince, or a member of an aristocratic household. He or she is a modern person living in a modern world. Their ancestors may have been rulers, soldiers, merchants, farmers, or members of royal households, but 800 years of history separates them from the original family. Languages changed, religions changed, borders changed. Entire civilizations rose and disappeared. The descendants adapted to all of it. The famous 16 million figure, therefore, tells only part of the story. Even if the genetic hypothesis is broadly correct, it does not mean that 16 million men can prove they descend from Genghis Khan. It means that a particular Y chromosome lineage became extraordinarily widespread, and researchers propose that its expansion could be explained by the reproductive success of the Mongol imperial elite. The actual number of confirmed descendants is far smaller and much harder to calculate because confirmation requires genealogy or stronger genetic evidence than simply carrying a widespread haplogroup. The number of descendants through female lines is even harder to estimate because mitochondrial DNA and autosomal DNA follow different inheritance patterns and become increasingly difficult to assign to one specific medieval ancestor. After 30 generations, a person may have thousands or millions of genealogical ancestors, many of whom may have left only tiny genetic traces in the present generation. Being someone's genealogical descendant does not necessarily mean that detectable DNA from that particular ancestor remains in your genome. That scientific detail creates an extraordinary paradox. It is possible for someone to be a genuine descendant of Genghis Khan in their family tree, while carrying no identifiable piece of DNA that can be uniquely attributed to him. At the same time, someone carrying a genetic lineage associated with the Mongol ruling elite may have no documentary evidence connecting him to the Great Khan. Genealogy and genetics overlap, but they are not identical. One follows historical relationships, the other follows biological inheritance. After 8 centuries, those two stories can become incredibly difficult to align. And there is something else that gets overlooked whenever the descendants of Genghis Khan are discussed. Not every descendant would necessarily want to be found. Imagine discovering that your ancestor was one of history's most famous conquerors. For one person, that might be a source of pride. For another, it might mean nothing. For someone else, it could be deeply uncomfortable. The modern descendants did not choose the wars of the 13th century. They did not choose the empire. They did not choose their ancestors. They simply inherited a family history that became one of the most extraordinary stories on Earth. That is why responsible historical research has to distinguish ancestry from identity. Carrying someone's blood does not mean carrying their beliefs, ambitions, or moral responsibility. Carrying someone's blood does not mean carrying their beliefs or moral responsibility. We begin with a conqueror who appears to stand alone at the center of history. Then we discover his sons, and the sons become rulers. We discover their children, and those children create new dynasties. We follow the dynasties into Central Asia, China, Iran, Russia, and the steppe. Eventually, the royal family becomes mixed with local populations. The titles disappear, the surnames change, the political system collapses. Centuries pass. Then, scientists begin examining DNA and discover that one paternal lineage may have survived on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend. But perhaps the most extraordinary possibility is not that millions of people may descend from Genghis Khan. It is that we may never know exactly who they are. History usually gives us names, dates, and graves. In this case, history gives us fragments. We have chronicles describing his sons and grandsons. We have genealogies preserved by families. We have archaeological remains from the states created by his descendants. We have modern populations carrying genetic signatures associated with the Mongol period. We have ancient DNA from medieval elites. But the one piece that could connect everything together, the DNA of Genghis Khan himself, remains missing. That missing piece has kept the mystery alive for generations. If his grave were found tomorrow, the story could change overnight. Researchers could test the remains and compare his Y chromosome with the lineages found among modern Chinggisid families. They could examine whether the famous genetic lineage truly originated with him. They could compare him with ancient Golden Horde individuals and perhaps reconstruct a clearer picture of how his descendants spread across Eurasia. Some family traditions could suddenly become scientifically supported. Others could be disproved. A mystery that has survived for 8 centuries could potentially be settled in a laboratory. Until then, the map remains incomplete. The descendants most strongly connected to historical Chinggisid traditions are found throughout Mongolia and Central Asia, particularly among families associated with the old ruling houses of the steppe. Descendants of Yochi's line became deeply embedded in the history of Kazakhstan and the broader Turkic-speaking world. Other branches spread through Central Asia, China, Iran, and regions influenced by the Mongol successor states. Some descendants remained identifiable as members of the ruling dynasty, while others disappeared into ordinary populations. The genetic legacy appears even broader, reaching across large parts of Asia, but that broader genetic signal cannot automatically be labeled Genghis Khan's blood. And that is perhaps the most honest answer. They are not in one country. They are not one tribe. They are not one surname. They are not one family that can be photographed together and presented as the surviving house of Genghis Khan. They are scattered. Some are known. Some are documented. Some are preserved in family traditions. Some may be hidden in genealogical records. Some may be carrying a genetic connection that scientists can detect but cannot yet attribute with certainty to Genghis Khan himself. And some may have absolutely no idea that their family tree reaches back to the man who changed the map of Eurasia. 8 centuries ago, Genghis Khan created an empire through conquest. His sons turned it into a dynasty. His grandsons carried that dynasty across continents. Their descendants entered new cultures, new religions, and new political worlds. The Mongol Empire eventually fractured, but the family continued moving through history. By the time modern nations appeared, the old imperial bloodline had become almost impossible to separate from the populations surrounding it. That is the final irony. Genghis Khan spent his life creating something enormous and visible. He wanted obedience, territory, power, and a legacy that would survive him. His empire was so vast that its influence can still be traced across Eurasia. Yet the most enduring part of his legacy may be the one thing he could never have mapped himself: the people who came after him. They do not ride across the steppe beneath his banners. They do not command armies. They do not rule from his throne. They live in cities, towns, villages, and communities spread across a world that would be almost unrecognizable to their ancestor. Some know their lineage, some preserve it carefully, some have abandoned the old names. Some have forgotten them entirely. And somewhere among them may be the descendants whose family trees connect directly to Xochi, Chagatai, Tolui, or another branch of the dynasty founded by Genghis Khan. The conqueror is gone. The empire is gone. The political system that carried his descendants to power is gone. But the family story continues, quietly, inside the modern world. And perhaps that is why the search for Genghis Khan's descendants is so compelling. We are not really searching for princes in hidden palaces. We are searching for traces of one human life across 800 years of history. We are following those traces through wars and migrations, through royal marriages and forgotten villages, through ancient bones and modern DNA, trying to reconstruct a family that became too large for any historian to completely map. The greatest empire of the 13th century eventually became history, but the people became something else. They became ancestors. And somewhere in the world today, a person who appears completely ordinary may carry a story that began on the Mongolian steppe, in a family that once stood at the center of the largest empire the medieval world had ever seen. He may never know the name of the ancestor who began that line. He may never see the ancient landscapes where that ancestor lived. He may never care about medieval history at all. Yet hidden inside his family tree may be a connection that survived invasions, dynasties, revolutions, borders, and centuries of change. That is the strange power of ancestry. Empires can disappear, names can change, palaces can become ruins, kings can become forgotten. But a family can survive in places no historian expects, carried forward by ordinary people who have no idea that their blood connects them to the most famous conqueror of the medieval world. And until the grave of Genghis Khan is finally found, one question will remain suspended between history and science. How much of the man who conquered Eurasia is still alive in the people of Eurasia today? The empire disappeared. The palace became a museum. The crown was lost. But somewhere in the world, ordinary people still carry the blood of the man who once ruled millions.